Welcome to Back to the Text Themselves, a series on phenomenology. Today's video covers sections 17 to 22 of Husserl's Cartesian Meditations. In the previous video, we unpacked the meaning of transcendental experience in contrast to ordinary experience and considered two fundamental notions in phenomenology, intentionality and the noesis-noema correlation. With these conceptual tools and in deploying the phenomenological epoche and reduction, we engage in phenomenological analysis, describing the particular modes of an intended consciousness and the particular modes of an intended object. But how is it that the variability and persistent fluctuations of our experience of something gives rise to an identifiable object in the first place? How are these experiences brought together even when we cannot simultaneously intuit every aspect of the object? And can the principles that give rise to a unified experience of individual objects contribute to a universal, systematic science of transcendental experience? These will be the questions we'll address in this video as we consider the concepts of synthesis, the consciousness of internal time, intentional horizons, and how these ideas might contribute to the notion of a universal constitutive synthesis, which transcendental phenomenology ultimately seeks to establish. Although I've used a variation of this example several times by now, it's worth repeating here. When encountering something like this, phenomenologically, I notice a few things. I notice that I can only see one side of the object, and when I turn it to see the other side, the previous side is gone. In the last video, I mentioned how what persists in all these views of the object is its spatial character, that the object presents itself as a thing extended in space, which is the condition of possibility for the object having various sides to look at all. Then there are the multiple ways I can approach the object. Attending to it in perception is only one mode of intentionality. I can also make judgments about it, that it has so many sides, that it's this color, this shape, etc. I can even deploy very different modes of intending wherein the object is no longer physically present, such as when I imagine it or perhaps recall it from a past experience. All of this manner of describing is potentially endless. But now the important question is this. What allows me to say that across all these variations that I'm still dealing with the one and the same object? If I was David Hume, I might mention the principles of association, wherein I identify an object based on resemblance across these variations. Associations are also made with regard to spatial and temporal proximity. Experiences that happen closely together in time and space are often grouped together in the mind as one thing. According to Hume, this happens through what are habits of the mind. And in many ways, Husserl is close to Hume on this point, and we'll get into the notion of habits in the third meditation. But along with Hume continuing to remain within the natural attitude, Husserl is critical of him for treating this kind of associationism as a matter of empirical and psychological laws rather than a matter of eidetic necessity. And in this sense, Husserl is closer to Kant, who claimed that there must be some a priori capacity for synthesis deployed by a transcendental subject. But unlike Kant, Husserl does not seem to view this synthesis as somehow independent of the experience of the thing itself. Instead, synthesis is an act uniquely belonging to consciousness, but one that requires accounting for the totality of the fluctuating noetic-noematic features of the intending consciousness with the intended object. Synthesis gives rise to the identity of a constituted object, allowing me to see all the variations as merely one thing rather than many. The principal means by which such a synthesis happens and the identity of something is encountered is through an ongoing consciousness of what Husserl calls internal time. This internal time is not to be confused with objective time, which is the standard model of time deployed in the natural sciences. There is the time of the object as it is found out there in the world, truly existing and caught up in the movement of causality. This time, the time of nature, is to be bracketed by the phenomenological epoche. But this bracketing does not do away with all experience of time. There remains what is called an internal temporality of the object perceiving, which is composed of a succession of nows brought together to give rise to the identity of something. This synthesis of these now moments always occurs through two other aspects of internal time: retention and protension. In retention, there is a trace of previous now moments that persist into the present now moment in the mode of the having been. Protension is a modification of retention to form an anticipation of what is not yet. And so, to perceive an object as this object, I must both hold on to the side I saw and behold the sides to be seen simultaneously while perceiving the object right now. This allows me to bring together the various perspectives into a unified synthesis of one thing. Important to mention is that even though I'm speaking as if retention and protension were active movements of consciousness, internal time consciousness is a passive experience, which is why this kind of synthesis is called a passive synthesis, and will be contrasted later on with what is called an active synthesis. The flux of experience in consciousness undergoes a synthetic unity which constitutes an object and delivers it its identity. The synthesis occurs through a consciousness of internal time that encapsulates the flow of experience through the retention and protension of now moments. However, constituting the identity of a synthesized object through a consciousness of internal time is not just a matter of beholding an object in its visible appearances, but also entails a consciousness of its invisible potentialities. This discloses another key characteristic of intentionality, which is that consciousness, when directed toward a content that gets synthesized as an identifiable object, also gets directed toward what Husserl calls a horizon of reference. Such a horizon includes a field of possible perceptions or pre-delineated potentialities that, though are presently empty of any intuitional fulfillment, await their actualization in conscious life. As such, these potentialities are available to be explicated, unfolded, or uncovered. Such horizons are intimately intertwined with internal time. And although these potentialities refer to an unactualized future, it also always entails a horizon of the past wherein there are stored memories that form the basis for horizons of possibility. These horizons present an invisible halo or background of possible conscious experiences that are surrounding a now moment. With new experiences, such horizons are liable to shift, and so rather than mark a definitive limit upon something, they are a fluid and indeterminate field containing ever-changing sets of possible investigations to be undertaken. For example, this object right here, which is identified as some kind of cube, is only identified within a horizon of its possible views, which I can actualize at any moment by turning the cube. That horizon is then altered once I realize that the object, which initially was merely a cube, is now discovered to be much more than that. This does not mean that the previous horizon was wrong, but merely incomplete, and with new experiences comes a broadening horizon with which I can behold this object. Furthermore, such horizons are not isolated from one another, and as we'll see, the world itself, as Husserl understands it, marks the horizon of all possible horizons. In the case of this object right here, there is the horizon pertaining to its shape, but also a horizon pertaining to its function, which as some kind of fidget toy now resides in a much wider set of horizons, all of which reside within the widest horizon of all, that being the world itself, as a horizon that constitutes the total range of possibilities available to me as a being in this world. Now, if you are getting some vibes of Heidegger from watching this video, you would be right to draw the connection. At the same time, we should be cautious when two philosophers use similar words in ways that seem like they mean the same thing. Like what I said last time about making hasty arguments, another temptation in our initial entry into philosophical thinking is to compare new ideas with other ideas we are more familiar with and conclude that they must mean the same thing. Now, no doubt there can be and often is a historical or conceptual connection at play, and when one philosopher uses a technical term in their own way, they often do so with full awareness of that history. So a thinking that seeks out similarities has its place, but it's wise not to lead with it since it risks ignoring critical differences. As such, we might instead ask ourselves something like, despite superficial similarities and possible influences at play, how do these ideas, as they're used by these respective philosophers, function differently within their systems of thought? What nuances are made by each philosopher that distinguishes their manner of deploying the term from how others have previously deployed it? For the philosopher, detail matters. It's why rigorous philosophical arguments demands this meticulous unpacking. Now, such a style of thinking turns many off from this kind of philosophizing, as it seems pedantic, excessive, and detached from all practical importance. Summarized by the question created by moderns to caricature medieval philosophy, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? There are certainly useless philosophical debates, and also what Freud called the narcissism of small differences. For this reason, it's best not to approach possible disagreements in a polemical style, but it's also the case that it can be difficult to discern the difference between a critical distinction and a petty nitpicking without in some ways already being fully immersed in the ideas themselves. I offer these thoughts not only because it's a kind of comment I sometimes see on these videos, but also because it's something I've been guilty of myself. So for example, when I first encountered Heidegger's thought in college, it was at a time I was immersed in reading a lot about Zen Buddhism and Taoist philosophy. And at that time, in light of Heidegger's notions of being in the world and the attempts to overcome dualistic thinking, I sort of jumped to the conclusion that what Heidegger had to say was already being said by those far more ancient and more approachable and practical systems of thought. And when I first encountered Husserl much later, I at first concluded pretty quickly that he was simply some neo-Kantian that didn't need to be read because he bears little resemblance to what comes after him, especially given the fact that he uses terms like transcendental that I thought were used in the same exact way as Kant used them, only to find out that the way he's using the word transcendental does significantly differ from Kant, even though there's also some overlap. Such hasty conclusions temporarily blinded me from noticing important differences that today leads me to label these older thoughts of mine as somewhat naive and simplistic. Building from the idea that intentionality is both characterized as synthetic and horizontal, we are then led to the task of the phenomenologist, which is intentional analysis. Intentional analysis considers and describes the multitude of conscious experiences flowing from the ever-shifting flux of subjective processes and how these come to be constituted as an identical object. The point of intentional analysis, however, is not merely to remain at the level of the particular, but to arrive at the most universal description of intentionality and consider objects not as particular objects, but in terms of their formal universality. And from there, try to derive the most encompassing categories with which one can describe intentional objects. This is where the task of intentional analysis moves into the task of transcendental theory, which seeks to systematically account for the most universal structural features, the widest of all being what is the ego cogito cogitatum, which then can be made more particular in the categories such as the formal ontological, which can be applied to any object whatsoever, whether real or ideal, and entails a consideration of objects in terms of being single objects, individual objects, universal objects, whole objects, all the way up to affair and relational complexes. Then there's the category of the material ontological that considers real regions of concrete objects, such as it being a spatial thing, an animate thing, inanimate thing, etc. The uncovering of these categorical objectivities, as Husserl calls them, allows us then to build up transcendental theories that are unique to particular modes of intending and intended objects, such as a theory of perception, a theory of judgment, a theory of volition, along with a theory of spatial things, a theory of psychophysical beings, a theory of human beings, etc. These distinct theories are to then be unified under a universal theory of any object whatsoever. As such, what Husserl is doing here seems to be building up a kind of taxonomy of universal necessary categories that will form the basis for transcendental phenomenology. The implication of establishing such categories points to a guiding principle for phenomenology, which is that the infinite multiplicities corresponding to an object is not pure chaos, that these multiplicities belong together in their possible synthesis, and that the unifying synthesis is governed by principles that phenomenological description can discover. This then speaks to the profound possibility of a universal constitutive synthesis in which all particular syntheses function together within a systematic, all-embracing order that includes all actual and possible objectivities and every actual and possible mode of consciousness related to these objectivities. However, and it's really important to add this, Husserl is clear that such a universal synthesis has not been achieved, but is a kind of anticipatory and regulating idea for transcendental phenomenology, serving as the aim for carrying out phenomenological investigations. If you found this video helpful and it's within your means, please consider making a super thank you tip. You can find the super thank you button below this video. If you wish to be an ongoing supporter of this channel, you can do so on Patreon, where I offer video transcripts and unedited materials. The link is below. I want to thank the following for already supporting this channel on Patreon. You can also support this channel by liking and sharing this video and subscribing to my channel. And until next time, be well.